All right. Welcome to episode 69 of Faith, Fitness, Joy. Today, I am talking about carb cycling. It has become one of my favorite nutrition approaches in recent years, and I've gotten really good results from doing this. So I thought, why not dive into carb cycling and give you guys the basics so that you can try it too and get some results for yourself as well. So that's what I'm discussing in today's episode of Faith, Fitness, Joy. So what I'm going to be covering today is first the basics, right? What are carbohydrates? Second, what is carb cycling? Third, benefits of carb cycling, and four, how you can carb cycle yourself. Now, as you know, if you've been listening to my podcast for a while, I have tried all the things when it comes to weight loss or losing weight. I've always had sort of a harder time with losing weight, and I've run into hitting plateau numerous times along my own weight loss journey. And so naturally, I started researching about that and trying to figure out, how can I break this pattern? How can I get myself moving forward? And so that led me to starting to learn about, a number of different things. And one of them that I came across was that sort of there's these different body types, and there's certain body types like mine where the body is sort of hardwired to hold on to fat or just really resist letting it go. And so it's like the more you try to do all these things to lose the weight, it's almost like it works against you, and your body like works even harder to hold on to your body fat. So naturally, as I started learning about that, I started researching, well, how can I overcome this? What can I do to kind of like get past this so I can get to my goals? And that's when I came across carb cycling. So let's get into it, shall we? So the first thing to understand, depending on how familiar you are with all of this, is what are carbohydrates? What does that mean, right? So before we can discuss carb cycling, obviously you need to have a good understanding of that. So carbohydrates is just one of three different of the main categories of macronutrients, right? There's all of the foods we consume can be broken down into three main categories of macronutrients. And so carbohydrates is one of them, and the other two are protein and fat. So this is why, you look at a nutrition label and you'll see, always see those on there, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And of course, you'll also see some other items on there as well. So within carbohydrates, there's two categories. There's simple carbohydrates and there's complex carbohydrates. So the nutshell with simple carbohydrates is that these are basically carbohydrates that result in a spike in your blood sugar, or they raise your blood sugar faster than complex carbohydrates. So they basically have a higher glycemic index. Complex carbohydrates will have a lower glycemic index, generally speaking. And the main reason for that is because complex carbohydrates usually have more fiber than simple carbohydrates. A lot of simple carbohydrates don't have any fiber at all. And a lot of carbohydrates kind of fall into the category of what we might think of as bad or junk food or empty calories, right? And so what does that mean? It means that they don't really have any nutritional value, right? There's just calories that you consume because they have calories in them. But other than that, there's no really benefit to your body. They don't really give your body much in the way of nutrition. So some examples of this are things like candy, soda or pop, and also certain types of coffee beverages that a lot of folks love to get, like these lattes or cafe mochas, or I don't even know what all there is because I'm not really a coffee drinker. And when I did drink coffee, I just drank my coffee black. So, but that being said, there's a lot of these different kind of coffee type drinks that folks love to have, and they have a ton of extra calories in them and a lot of sugar, and they don't really offer you any benefit beyond maybe helping you wake up. So those are some examples of simple carbohydrates. However, all of that said, it doesn't mean that everything that falls in the simple carbohydrate category is bad, right? There are simple carbohydrates that are fine. That's including things like white rice, even pasta, some types of breads, right? Like, so they're not all necessarily bad. It's just to be mindful that a lot of these simple carbohydrates don't really have much in the way of nutritional value for you. So that's the basics of what carbohydrates are. So now we can get into what carb cycling is. So carb cycling is basically just an eating method. If you've been listening to my podcast for a while, I hate the term diet, but if you want to call it a diet, you can think of it that way. And the idea is that you're eating different levels of carbohydrates every day of the week, depending on whatever carbohydrate cycle you set up and whatever your goals are, right? So the idea behind it is that you're aiming to optimize fat loss. You're looking to maintain your muscle mass and also help enhance muscle growth, and also to help boost your energy levels. So basically how it works is you're going to be alternating between high carbohydrate, moderate carbohydrate, and low carbohydrate days throughout the week. And again, it'll be different for everybody. So the amount for each of these is going to vary from person to person, because it's going to depend on, your goals, your current weight, your activity level, all kinds of other things are going to come into play. So it's going to be different for everyone. And you want to use like an online calculator to help figure out what your ideal carbohydrate cycle schedule would be. So in general, what happens is you have like a low carb day, right? And the low carbohydrates days, you will still have carbohydrates, right? Like, so for example, my carb cycle schedule, my low carb day is usually around 90 grams of carbs on my low carb days. And then it just basically means that it's the lowest level of carbohydrates that you're eating in your schedule. And then you have like the moderate carbohydrate days where you're eating more carbohydrates, but not necessarily like a max level. And then high carbohydrate days, you'll be eating a pretty high amount of carbohydrates. And what you'll see when you if you do this and you calculate your schedule and your cycle, you'll notice that the fat and the carbs offset each other. So if you're on a low carbohydrate day, you will have like a lower level of carbohydrates, like I said, but your fat level will be higher. So you'll be able to eat more fat on those days, but your carbohydrates will be lower. And then it's vice versa on your high carbohydrate days. So the high carbohydrate days, you will have a pretty high amount of carbohydrates that you're eating, but your fat amount is going to be pretty low, because it's a balance, right? Like you're still trying to stay within a certain max level of calories every day. You're just changing the proportion of those calories that are going to carbohydrates or fat for the most part. The protein levels will also fluctuate when you're doing your low, moderate, and high carbohydrate days, but you'll notice that regardless of if it's a low carb, moderate, or high carb day, your protein levels are going to still be pretty high, right? And that's because, and if you've ever done macro tracking before, you know that like protein is kind of like the one macro you don't want to be under on, and you always want to prioritize hitting your protein targets if nothing else. I mean, really, you should be hitting all of your macro targets, but that's kind of why you'll see that the protein levels are generally going to stay fairly high on any of your carb days, whether they're low, medium, high. So that's the gist of what carb cycling is. So what are the benefits of carb cycling? Well, the benefits of carb cycling include things like fat loss, muscle retention, improved efficiency of your metabolism, and also they help regulate, or it helps regulate your hormones, right? So, and I find this so interesting because some of the very issues that can make it difficult for a lot of us to lose weight can actually be helped with carb cycling. So I mentioned earlier that certain body types are really kind of hardwired to hold on to body fat and not let it go, and also really resist like fat loss. So carb cycling really helps you overcome that if that is you, or if you have that type of body, because it sort of tricks your metabolism, to put it really simply, and it's sort of like gets your body more acclimated to alternating between using the food that you eat as fuel and using your stored body fat as fuel. So basically it's helping to get your body out of that inclination of like resisting fat loss to using stored body fat for fuel, which is going to help you decrease your fat amount, your body fat. The other thing that happens is it helps with the hormones, right? So hormones are another really big factor, especially for women, when it comes to weight loss. So, and I think this is kind of ironic because what happens is you're trying to lose weight, right? And then you get stuck. Or like, and this has happened to me too, where I'm like religiously adhering to my diet. I'm sticking with my exercise, like I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. And I'll plateau and then I'll start going up in weight. Again, not increasing food intake, not decreasing exercise, and I will actually gain weight. And that, as you can imagine, is incredibly frustrating. And I'm sure others of you out there have had that happen. So why does that happen? Well, ironically, because when that happens, what do? Right? Like you instantly are like, oh, I better cut back on what I'm eating even more. And I better go harder in the gym. I better do more cardio. I better like do higher intensity workouts. I need to do more, right? Like that's like the knee-jerk reaction. But that's exactly the opposite of what you should do. And actually, when we do this, we're just making everything worse because it's all tied to hormones. And when we do that, we actually kind of screw up our metabolism, and then we get our hormones out of whack, and that's how it all starts to like work against us. So this is another thing that carb cycling helps us with, because it helps us to regulate the hormones and get them back in balance and get them functioning the way that they should be, especially some of the hormones that are really key with regard to metabolism, like leptin and insulin. So that's another way that carb cycling can really help the body and help us with our goals. So last is, how do you do carb cycling? Like, how does one get started with this, right? So as I mentioned before, there's tons of free resources available on the internet that you can use to help you. So the first thing you're going to want to do is find a carb cycling macro calculator. And there's a number of them out there that you can find. And so you want to get that, and so that you can determine whatever your own unique schedule is. And then once you have that, you want to follow at least 90% adherence, right? So you want to make sure that 90% of the time you are hitting those macros perfectly. Ideally, you want to hit the macros perfectly 100% of the time. But again, with everything else that I talk about here, it's a process of change, and it can be a challenge to do that. So just know it's going to take some time. So in order to do this, you're going to have to weigh your food, measure your food, track your food every day so that you know you're hitting your macro targets. And you can't get away from measuring and weighing your food. You have to know exactly how much you're eating. Otherwise, you are not going to be certain of the amount of macronutrients that you're getting at each meal, serving, whatever, right? So that's really important. If macro tracking is new to you and you're not very familiar with it, you can check out my previous episode. It's number 25, and it's called How to Get Started with Macro Tracking. So I go in depth about macro tracking and how you do that, how you figure it out, and all of that. So if you need some more information about that, check that episode out. And then the other thing you're going to need to be doing with this is to check your progress every 2 weeks. Okay, this is going to be really important. I always think this is a slippery slope, especially for us ladies, because getting on the scale can be a whole situation, but it's really important to keep track. So I would advise, and actually when you're doing macro tracking, you want to check everything in 2-week increments. So don't weigh yourself more than that. But get on the scale every 2 weeks and check your measurements every 2 weeks as well. So that's, using a tape measure, checking your waist, your chest, your thighs, all of that, so that you can see where you are. And what you're looking for is you're looking for either one of two things or both of these things. You want to see a drop in the scale, and or you want to see a decrease in your body measurements, right? So sometimes it can happen where the scale won't budge, but your measurements will decrease, right? So you might see a drop of 1/2 inch on your waist, for example. Sometimes it can even happen where your weight might go up, but your measurements will go down. This can happen too. So just be aware of that. Pictures is another great way to track progress as well, but it's not really going to help you so much with assessing your progress on the macros. So you want to check your progress, and that's going to help you know if it's working, if you have your macro levels right. So if you're losing weight, or you're shrinking in terms of measurements, then stick with the macros that you're at and stick with your cycle because it's working. If you are not seeing a change and you're not like, and that means no drop on the scale or no change in your measurements in terms of decrease, then one of two things. So first, I wouldn't change the macros or the schedule immediately. I would go another 2 weeks and see what happens. If after another 2 week cycle, you're not seeing any change and you're not seeing a drop in the scale, then you want to go back and recalculate your macros and reevaluate your cycle. Maybe you need to change to a different cycle. You might need to do more or less low carb days or something like that. So there is some trial and error with it, but which is also why it's so important to check every 2 weeks. But it is really the reason I love macro tracking in general is that you have more latitude, right? You can eat more things. There's not really any off limit things per se. There's sort of a general rule. If it fits your macros, you can eat it, so long as you're not going over or falling under on any one of those three categories of protein, fat, or carbohydrates. That being said, I do like to really try to focus on also eating good quality food, like, vegetables and fruit and complex carbohydrates. And my focus is more on the health. But the beauty with macros is that you have more flexibility than maybe some other diets or nutrition approaches. So, and then, like I said, I shared the benefits with carb cycling and how that kind of adds that extra benefit to the macro approach in general. So that is all about carb cycling and how you can get started doing this for yourself. As always, I hope you find this helpful. Please share your thoughts in the comments or results. I would love to hear about your results and your wins and your success stories with this. So please share them in the comments. And that concludes today's episode of Faith, Fitness, Joy. I would love to hear from you, like I said, so share in the comments. And if you find this helpful and you want to continue the pursuit of faith, fitness, and joy with me, please like and subscribe. And you can also find all things mind, body, and soul health on the website at faithfitnessjoy.com. All right, friends, thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.